Okay. So yeah, again, just for the sake of the recording, climate change in All Black Then White, West Africa edition. So we're going to start with the next slide, and it's a quiz. So guess the flags. So there are 3 flags from West African countries. So the first one, do people have an idea? Do people think it's Mauritania, Cape Verde, or Senegal? You can just write in the chat which one you think. Oh, thank you. I like the title as well. So yeah, feel free to just put in the chat A, B, or C if you, for the country that you think the first flag belongs to. B, C. Okay. Does anyone else want to have a guess? B, okay. A, all right. Okay, I'll just say. It belongs to Cape Verde. So whoever put B is correct. That is the flag for Cape Verde. And Cape Verde is just off the west coast of Africa. So it's like an island. It's not in mainland Africa. It's just off on that. It's an island off the coast. So the second flag, do you think it's A, Mali, Benin, or C, Guinea-Bissau? And again, you can just put it in the chat. A, Mali, okay. C, Guinea-Bissau. A. A, B. Okay, well, whoever put the genre, I'm joking. The correct answer is A, it is Mali. That is the flag of Mali. So there's just like 3 vertical colors, and it goes green, then yellow / gold, then red. So yeah, the final flag, do people think it's A, Burkina Faso, B, Liberia, or C, Togo? A, C, B, A, okay. Okay, well, the correct answer, okay, Izzy just going along. And the correct answer is C, it is Togo, and that's the flag for Togo. But yeah, these are just, you know, a quick quiz to get us started, so we can go on to the next slide. So do you want to take this one? Is it allowing you to unmute now?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just to like kick off, I guess, this first proverb, so these are like all African proverbs. This first proverb, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. My mum says this to me almost all the time. And the way that I was thinking of it was in terms of of course the climate crisis created by the global north would first keenly be felt by the global south, because when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And that the global north are those elephants too concerned with like besting each other at the expense of the grass that they're trampling underfoot. So yeah, this first proverb really just for me perfectly encapsulates like the, I guess, geopolitics of climate change and the climate crisis, and how the global south is suffering disproportionately from a climate crisis that they did not create. Yeah. And then the second proverb, do not call the forest that shelters you a jungle. This is a Ghanaian proverb. I couldn't find where exactly in Ghana it was from. But this proverb made me think about the language and the words that we use, particularly when we're talking about climate change or the climate crisis, and the way those words like obscure the damage that we're doing to the environment. The vocabulary that has emboldened us to lay claim to land that we could never really own. I'm thinking particularly, I watched this documentary on the tar sands in Canada, the oil underneath the tar sands in Canada. And the like engineers or whatever were talking about the natural like land. And they kept on referring to it as the overburden, as an overburden, because they needed to clear like all that like surface stuff, the trees, the fields, etc., to be able to get to the oil underneath. And using language like that, calling it an overburden instead of like a natural ecological system that people, like Indigenous people in the tar sands, have depended on and lived alongside for centuries, allows you to relate to that land as if you can claim it, as if it's yours to claim, if that makes sense. Yeah, so you know, we just need to clear the overburden to get at the oil money. But what we're obscuring when we call it an overburden is that we're obscuring the nature, the important and vital ecologies, and not least the Indigenous generational relationships with the land in the tar sands of Canada. Also, more generally, like the language that empires have created of nations, national symbols, and countries as country names as tied to commerce, industry, and capitalism. I'm thinking like, you know, West Africa, or the names that empire gave to West Africa, like the Gold Coast and Ivory Coast, and how like that serves to obscure that as a land of people and more of a land of commerce, of gold to be extracted, of ivory to be shipped out. So yeah, so don't call the forest that shelters you a jungle. Don't use language that obscures the real like relationships with that land. Don't treat nature or the environment as a capitalist opportunity for profit. Don't look at it as money to be made. Like that, those are real animals. Those are real people who depend on that land. And treating it as like profit to be made has very real life and death impacts and consequences on so many people. So yeah, so those were the two proverbs that I was meant to.
Yeah, and the next two, so loving someone who does not love you is like loving the rain that falls in the forest, which is an Akkad proverb. And the hyena chasing two antelopes at the same time will go to bed hungry, which is a Malian proverb. And while these two proverbs don't like necessarily relate to the climate crisis, or yeah, they don't relate to the climate crisis directly, I think this is more to say that Indigenous cultures in West Africa have always used nature and animals like culturally, and they've always used it like metaphorically. But I think with the climate crisis, with the way that like rainfall is changing and the timings of rain, and also with animals going extinct and things like that because of the climate crisis, I think this is just to say that we need to be very careful in the climate crisis, in not only like preserving the world, because we do want to preserve nature and we do want to preserve the world, but I think at the same time it's important to note that these proverbs are only possible because the hyena exists and because, you know, like antelopes exist, whereas the same knowledge can't be passed on using these proverbs if the climate crisis completely eradicates all these symbols of nature that have been used to pass down like knowledge intergenerationally. So yeah, I think it's very important that the climate crisis is seen as something that's very current now, but it's also necessary in the wider context of preserving our culture and preserving our traditions. So that being said, we'll go on to the next slide. So yeah, West Africa, a colonial past. So, I mean, how do you fit in the years and decades and centuries of environmental degradation, you know, trauma to the land, trauma to the communities, wildlife displacement into a slide? I mean, you don't. But in a nutshell, I found a quote from this book, Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance and the Black Freedom Movement, by Monica M. White and LaDonna Redmond. And I thought it was really interesting, so I'll just read it out. So it says, the millions of men, women and children who were kidnapped from their homelands in Africa and transported through the Middle Passage in the most extreme case of forced deportation in world history possessed knowledge of microclimates and the particular kind of crops that they could grow in the places where they would toil as enslaved. And I think with West Africa, not to kind of like remove it from West Africa and talk about the like diaspora, but with the knowledge and with all the information that was used in the indigenous communities in terms of farming, in terms of like harvest hands and all of those things, colonialism fractured the way that knowledge was passed down. And although these people who were migrated to North America and to like various colonies still possess those knowledge, still possess that knowledge, they were, the way that they possessed it and their kind of their necessity to retain it like colonialism completely messed things up. Like it completely, I don't know what the word is, but it completely like just shook the tables. And so, yeah, I think when thinking about West Africa and the colonial past of the colonial past of West Africa, in regards to the climate crisis, this knowledge and this population decrease that happened so quickly in the colonies meant that the climate crisis, it meant that land in those communities were oftentimes neglected because there weren't people to administer their knowledge correctly. So, and going on to what Asosa was speaking about, how namings of these colonies and naming of these countries. So at the bottom left, there's the flag of Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire, and then next to that is the flag of Ghana, which was previously called the Gold Coast. And I think the fact that these countries, these West African countries, were initially named after not the people, not the communities, and it was named because of what the countries could do for Britain. It was named because they could, I mean, not just Britain, but also France as well, in the case of Ivory Coast. But they were completely formed and named out of their use as opposed to what they existed, like their existence anyway. I think that's quite sinister to think about, because also kind of like, also when thinking about the Gold Coast in particular, the fact that gold was so heavy, like gold was such an integral part of Britain's like colonial regime in the Gold Coast, is made even sadder when thinking about the amount of like gold artifacts are held in museums here. And it just brings to question, okay, as much as people say that colonialism is over, we know that that isn't the case, because these countries, although the Gold Coast is no longer called the Gold Coast and it's called Ghana, there's still that element of gold being integral and Ghana being connected to Britain through its gold, if that makes sense. So that's just a brief context of what I think. If anyone has anything that they want to say, again, feel free to put it in the chat. If not, we can move on to the next slide.
I was just going to add as well, like what Rachel was saying in the beginning about like that knowledge that's lost, like that's like irreparable damage. Like that's not knowledge that can be retrieved. Like that's knowledge that was passed down over hundreds of years that's just kind of now gone. And I was thinking about like how, like, you know, harm reduction or etc. Like how do you even address that kind of like serious type of loss of knowledge? Like how does reparations cover that? Like what can actually be done? And I was just thinking about the permanence of colonialism, like the permanence of this, like is so deep in West Africa. Also as well, like as Rachel was saying about the exploitation of West African countries for their natural resources. Colonialism was very blatant about this. It didn't really hide behind much. Like it named these countries the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast, and it's not just that their natural resources and their value was funneled into building the West, as like this excerpt and the bottom right of the screen shows, but it also altered and then determined how Africa would be understood, how Africa would be measured, how their use or value or potential would lie in their mineral wealth, not in the people, and how that would be determined for them, not for themselves. So when we're looking at the climate change or environment and colonialism, we really have to emphasize the way that West Africa was cherished for its instrumental value, for the instrumental value that it provided empire. On an epistemological level, colonialism altered the meaning of Africa, a land of cash in the ground rather than people, families, and like beautiful nature. So the history of colonialism and how it relates to climate change really can't be understated. It's so important to emphasize.
Yeah, and just going off that and also linking to her story as well. In the case of Sierra Leone, so the flag at the top right, in the case of like Sierra Leone, where there was a civil war that displaced so many people, and so many people were forced to migrate because their situation was so drastically, like it was terrible, and they were forced to migrate. But the reason why, or one of the reasons why Sierra Leone was targeted in the first place, or why a civil war did occur, was because of its natural resources, was because of its diamonds. And when thinking about how natural resources, like they exist, like the diamonds exist in Sierra Leone, yes, but the way that it was like mined, and the way that it was approached by the colonial like powers, completely, I mean, as much as like the civil war wasn't, it didn't occur because of the climate crisis, it didn't occur because of diamond mining, like in particular, but all these factors contributed to the eventual displacement of so many families. And because it was overworked, and I think in regards to the other event that we had in like looking at the Caribbean, in terms of Haiti, where because the land was so damaged, because there was nearly nothing left, it meant that the lives and the well-being of people, in the country was drastically impacted because of that. So even though there isn't like a direct link, it's important to consider like all of the factors that coincide with each other, that mean that the climate crisis in those countries now, where because of the civil war, for example, like healthcare is terrible, or where like land and housing and healthcare and all these factors are exacerbated by the climate crisis, which means that not only is Africa underdeveloped, but it's also overworked as well, because I know that there's like a discourse around that, and we will get onto like Africa being underdeveloped and overworked. So that being said, we can move on to the next slide. So
Rachel, you can go.
okay. So this is essentially, the rest of this event will just be a discussion. So please feel free to put your hands up if you have anything like you want to say, or if you just agree with anyone, want to bounce off anyone's like points. Yeah, this is honestly, the rest of this is a discussion. So we will be talking about what climate change looks like in West Africa. So our first point on the next slide is farming and reduction of arable land. So Associate, if you want to take it on.
Yeah, so I think it's important here to understand that the climate crisis is not just natural disasters or phenomenons of drought, inconsistent rainfall, but that these have very real impacts on people. The climate crisis is at the same time a refugee crisis. So I'm thinking particularly like of the middle belt in Nigeria. Essentially what's going on at the moment is that northern Nigeria has become too hot, and the arable land, I think cattle is farmed up in northern Nigeria, but the arable land for those cattle has decreased. And so farmers in northern Nigeria have been moving down further south into the middle belt, and the middle belt is where agriculture is farmed, and there's a huge competition now for arable land in the middle belt, and it's caused so much conflict, so much fighting. Like entire villages have been wiped out, thousands of people have been killed. So when we're talking about like food insecurity or the reduction of arable land, like those are people's like lives lost as a result. And like more specifically on Nigeria again, like most likely Nigeria will run out of arable land before it runs out of oil. And if that happens, Nigeria will run out of people before it runs out of oil. And measuring Nigeria by its oil fields in the Delta region is therefore so beyond dangerous and toxic. But again, it's this logic of colonialism and global capitalism. It doesn't care about the people in the Middle Belt, about those farmers in northern Nigeria who have been displaced from their land, because it only cares for the oil that's found in southern Nigeria. And also talking about like refugees, like those northern farmers in Nigeria, as divorced and displaced from the lands that they farmed on for generations. Their land is irreversibly changed. They can't return to it because they can no longer live on it. And the communal and personal impacts of the reduction of arable land, you know, are so profound. So when looking at like some of the more, I guess, scientific conversations on like arable land, etc., like looking at the reduced daylight, the changing in the rainfall, etc., like it's so important to always center the people who have been have lost their lives, essentially, have lost their livelihoods, have lost generational links with the land as a result of a climate crisis, which again they did not create. Like the consequences of the climate crisis at the moment are being exported from the West to, or have been exported from the global North to the global South. But the global South did not create this climate crisis. Yeah, there's other stuff on the slide that I guess you can read, but yeah.
Yeah, and kind of like going off what you were saying in terms of like farmers migrating and like going into other areas, as it says on the slide, I think that inevitably is an element of conflict, because with colonialism and with capitalism, it has been like individualism has been so encouraged, where it's like, this belongs to me. And the fact that borders exist and there's like, this belongs to a particular group of people, or this belongs to a particular person. So when circumstances change because of the climate crisis and because of like changing patterns in rainfall and changing temperatures, it means that for people to literally survive, they need to move, but their movement is made synonymous with conflict. And I think that's very dangerous, because it also means that their survival is being made synonymous with conflict. And as you said, like, what is Earth without humans? Like, what, as we know it anyway, and for humans to not exist in the way that we know it because of something that wasn't even created by those West African communities is very unfortunate. And it's like, it's very saddening. I think it's just very sad. If anyone else has anything they want to say, again, feel free to like put it in the chat or raise your hand. I don't know. Okay. We can go on to the next slide.
Yeah, okay. So food insecurity. So as a result of this reduction of arable land, you know, inconsistent rain patterns, droughts, famine, etc., food has become incredibly insecure. Rising temperature, rising food prices, too much rainfall, too little rainfall, fishing days lost, overfishing, etc. But this food insecurity is also heightened by like neoliberal policies, and I guess this is bringing in that link of like colonialism and neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism, like the neoliberal policies like enforced on the global South, enforced on West African countries by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, are heightening and exacerbating food insecurity for West Africans living in West Africa. Policies such as like cash cropping, for example. So cash cropping is essentially like, say, for example, you use your land to grow, I don't know, like sugarcane. Sugarcane is a really good example, actually, to grow sugarcane. And that's all you grow. But before you were doing subsistence farming. So you were using the land to provide for everything that your family would need nutritionally. But now, because of like international pressure, the government has encouraged you to use your land instead to farm sugarcane and to sell sugarcane and become drawn into the global market, which is already always rigged against you to grow sugarcane. But growing that sugarcane reduces the land available for subsistence farming. It thrusts farmers into a global market that is rigged against them. The gendered impacts that this has as well is also so profound, because it's generally women in the global south who do the brunt of that subsistence farming. Women produce 90% of the food consumed in the homes of the global south, but they only own 1% of the land. And most of the rest of the land is owned by men who are cash cropping. This cash cropping makes it difficult to practice crop rotation, to grow the traditional foods that indigenous people desire and demand. You're instead catering to the whims of a Western-dominated global market instead of the nutritional needs of your family. So when we look at food insecurity, it is a consequence of climate change, like rising temperatures, rising food prices, the inconsistent rain patterns, drought, famine, etc., etc. But it's also important to understand that even within food insecurity, we see the old or the new arms of colonialism, of neocolonialism, and global north dominance in the global south. Food insecurity is exacerbated by a global capitalist market, which does not allow the farmer to grow what he needs to survive, but rather what puts money in the bank, or puts money in his bank. So in doing research, I found pictures of farmers and communities, families who were nutritionally deficient, like they were malnourished, but they were cash or material rich. So they had, they owned watches, they owned bicycles and cars and stuff like that, but they were malnourished. They did not have the land to farm the food that would keep them nourished, and they weren't able to buy it because there was food shortage. Cash cropping means cash over food and nutrition. And kind of going into what we'll talk about later about non-governmental organizations, but often I found like when NGOs are now coming to address food insecurity, their efforts are to reduce or meet food insecurity as it pertains to cash cropping. So it's trying to protect essentially it's trying to shelter cash cropping from the consequences of the climate crisis, not subsistence farming, not the farming that people need to do in order to be like nourished. Food insecurity is often or perceived by many NGOs as a threat to the Western world and their supply of coffee, avocados, etc., and not considering food insecurity as a threat to the livelihoods and nutrition of those people producing these cash crops. And again, as well, like just to highlight the gendered consequences of this, like it's women who are expected to meet the nutritional needs of their family, and when those nutritional needs aren't met, it's women that go without, who eat less in order for the men in the family to continue to have the energy to continue producing these cash crops. So it almost becomes like a incomplete, like very vicious cycle. So yeah, so that's just on food insecurity. Is there any like comments or questions on that?
I just want to add, I think with fishing especially, when we think of like the climate crisis, it's so easy to kind of not consider West Africa or Africa in general, because there aren't that many like tornadoes, and there aren't that many hurricanes, and there aren't that many like natural disasters that greatly impacts like the continent. But when we think about like rising sea levels and overfishing and just fishing in general, but the dangers that then come with fishing, that often mean that many of the fishermen are often left like what's the word? It's a very simple word. They're often left injured, that's the word. They're also left injured by their work, and it then means that they aren't able to go out and provide for their family in the way that they previously had been able to. So then not only does it become like a matter of life, not only does it become a matter of life and death, it also means that it's also very ableist in the way that food insecurity, and also in the way that the climate crisis does pan out for many like fishermen and people who put their lives at risk by going to like get food and farm food basically.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, so deforestation and desertification. So in 2017, 40 football fields of tropical forests were lost every minute. This was spurred by growing demand not only for cocoa, but also for palm oil, soybeans, timber, beef, and rubber, according to the Global Forest Watch. And the Ivory Coast as well has lost 80% of its forests over the past 50 years. This is also like linking into the point on reduction of arable land that I made in the beginning as well, and how again like this quote on the slide from an article about the global chocolate industry and its links to deforestation and desertification, again about how this is happening in order to meet like demand from the global north, from the west, in terms of the market as they've rigged it, and the market as in what they desire from it, and then the impacts that this has on West Africa, like on the communities in West Africa. Deforestation and desertification leads to intense migration, which, as we already like talked about, leads to conflict as well. I don't really have much to say on this slide because I feel like it's just repeating what I've already said. But is there anyone that wants to add anything on deforestation and desertification?
I'll add. So, I think for desertification and deforestation, a large element of it is wildlife displacement, and we will get onto like talking about animals and plants and everything. But when we acknowledge that deforestation not only has an impact on the soil, but also on the wildlife around it, and how people depend on that wildlife to feed their families and to also navigate if they are like if they live in rural areas. Oftentimes animals can say a lot about maybe like the changes in weather, for example, and without that to signal other things, it means that they're often left in a place of like kind of like sitting in limbo, like they're not too sure what's going to happen in the context of the environment, because there aren't those signals that are usually there for them. And I also think in terms of this actual like where this extract is from, it says the trouble with chocolate, a decade after Mars and other chocolate makers vowed to stop rampant deforestation. And I think that contextualizes the like who is actually doing this, because sometimes it's like, okay, we know that it's happening, but we're not too sure who's doing this. But we know in this case, it's chocolate companies. It's like at the end of the day, it is capitalism. It is people who want to increase their profits. They want to maximize their profits at the expense of land that they're not emotionally tied to, which is why I don't even know if this why it's so easy for them to do so, but it's why it's so easily accepted, because these communities that do depend on these like lands and these trees and the wildlife, etc., aren't the focal point. They're not their main audience, so they don't care. Whereas without those communities, they wouldn't even exist. And I think that's just the nature of capitalism, exploiting people for financial gain. And yeah, that's why we should abolish capitalism as well. But so.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I was also thinking about how I watched a video clip on the cocoa beans. Cocoa beans. And it was showing how like the farmers had cut down trees cut down trees in order to make more space to grow cocoa beans, because they were receiving pressure from like their local authorities to grow more cocoa beans, because like their government was like being pressured because of like all the international being like forcing them by the World Bank and the IMF, etc. And I was just thinking of the violence of like forcing people to cut down their own trees in order to produce a product that they can't consume themselves, that they have been thrust into a global market to like sell at such a low rate and get so little back from. And then, you know, as a result of them cutting down those trees, like you said, like the loss of biodiversity, the loss of animals that they also use to survive on as well. And then thinking about like how neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism, how violent it is to use your own hands to harm you. Do you know what I mean? Like forcing people to cut down trees that they rely on so that you can continue buying cocoa beans and growing cocoa beans and chocolate, etc., at the rate that you're demanding it. So yeah, it's abolished capitalism all the way. Yeah.
And also on that, I think it's so interesting because a lot of the farmers who do harvest cocoa beans, they don't know what chocolate tastes like. Like what Marx was referring to about like the process of alienation, they're completely removed from that process, even though they sacrifice so much. And they sacrifice things not only at their expense, but at the expense of their families, their communities, and future generations to come. And they don't even come in contact with the final product in the way that we do. Like it's everywhere. Go to Tesco, you'll find chocolate bars. Go to the corner shop, you'll find chocolate bars. Like it's actually everywhere. It's in excess, and they're completely removed from that. It's like there's no benefit there anyway, you know. But we can go to the next slide if no one else has anything they could say. So on Indigenous community displacement, kind of like drawing on what Asosa said, how many farmers move. I think when we think about like displacement, it's not only is it in terms of like the workers, it's also in terms of just civilians, like children, people like children who want to go to school in their communities, but I said, no, like we need to migrate because the land isn't good for us. Like we can't survive on the land. And the one thing when I was like researching that I found really interesting was the Sahel region, and it covers like the whole bit in orange, which is the whole scope. Like it is the widest part of Africa, and the whole region is, especially now, is completely being like fractured and displaced because of the climate crisis. So many Sahelian farmers are forced to like migrate and move. But then even I wanted us to have a discussion about the language of migration, because a lot of the time it's very easy to say like, oh yeah, this person migrated, these farmers are migrating. But I don't know, I feel like there's a violence that is intrinsic to this migration that means it's more than migration. It's displacement, it's being uprooted and forced out of your community, the same way many like West Africans and Central Africans were forced and displaced out of their communities during slavery, in the same way like civil wars and like rising temperatures and the climate crisis is displacing so many people. So I don't know, what do people think about migration, the language of migration? What words should we use, or like should we continue using migration, just know the context that it's being said in? Like what do people think?
I think I definitely agree about the language of like, oh yeah, Naz, they can't unmute themselves.
Well, if you put your hand up and then I'll just unmute you accordingly.
Yeah, like there's definitely oh sorry. If you go to reactions, like the little smiley face, and you press on it, and then it will say raise hand underneath. Yeah. Sorry, the messages are distracting me. Yeah, sorry, the language of like migration, because there's definitely like levels to migration, right? If I moved from the UK to Africa, like I migrated, like I've moved, right? But that's not the same as someone migrating because their land is literally untenable, like they literally cannot live on that land anymore. And also thinking as well about like for example, like when I was looking at the tar sands in Canada, they interviewed an Indigenous woman, and she was talking about how painful it was for them to leave and for them to move because their ancestors are buried on that land. Like their ancestors were buried in the northwestern part of the lake in the tar sands, a lake which they no longer have access to, by the way, because that land was sold to an oil corporation. Anyway, so like it's not just like if I pack my bags and leave, like okay, like I'll miss my family, whatever, but for them it's like a complete divorce from even like identity as well, like from links, like familial links, like, and knowing that you cannot return. Like if I move to Australia, I can always move back, but you can't return if you're a climate refugee. Like it's untenable for you to live there. So yeah, I think the language of migration is a little bit problematic just because it groups all of these people under one banner, when some people are migration, there's definitely levels of privilege within migration as well.
Yeah, most definitely. Hannah, I'm gonna ask you to unmute. Let me,
Yeah, can you hear me?
yeah.
Okay, so it's kind of like a tangent from migration, more about like language and kind of like science in general. But I was thinking about so I study biology, and one of the case studies we looked at for the climate crisis was the Chagos Islands, which are like a group of islands where all of the people were like forced out of their homes back in the 60s because the US and the UK wanted to build a military base. And then like a couple of years ago, like the UK government was talking about, you know, like allowing these people to return to their homes. And they did like a ton of studies, like scientific, like economic studies to see whether it would be like feasible and like a bio in terms of like biodiversity, like other scientific concepts. But for me, it was like like they didn't actually consider like how these people felt about being displaced and like the life histories and like their connection to the Chagos Islands, like just in terms of like how, I don't know, how kind of like racialized people are dehumanized and like their identities aren't like seen as important when we have these discussions about like the climate and about like climate crisis issues. That's just what I was thinking about. Sorry to go off on a tangent.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's important, even though we're talking about like West Africa, we see that a lot of the time like connections can be made because colonialism doesn't discriminate based on location. I mean, sometimes like, yeah, it doesn't discriminate based on location. So we can see and we can draw a lot of the links in between. So thank you. And Nicole, I'm gonna ask you to unmute now. So let me know if you can.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just like, it made me think of the people who, like, in terms of like migration or displacement, I feel like migration kind of implies a level of like choice in the movement, whereas like displacements, like they don't have a choice. And I feel like, say for example, if you look at nomads who their lifestyle is essentially migration, but they have patterned it in a way that they kind of move with the seasons. So they know the land, they know how to navigate the land in terms of crop growth and like sustaining themselves. And I feel like with migration and displacement, a lot of the times it's like they don't have rights to the land in a sense, because they don't, like, say for example with nomads, they don't have legal citizenship in a lot of cases. So when they do move, it's like they lose the rights, and then they find that, say for example, a city has expanded outwards, and then they can't return back to where they came from, and like they can't navigate the way in which they normally would. And I feel like the language, essentially, yeah, I do think it is important, because sometimes it's like, what do you do when people are made unaware that they've essentially been kicked out of something that they've had for like centuries and years?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think what you were saying about like rights to land and how that is so important when it does come to migration and like displacement, because having those rights to land is still a form of colonialism. It's still a way for colonial like empires to have their colonial subjects under wraps, for them to still control them. So even though they are migrating, even though they are engaging with like their indigenous culture through migration, there's still an element of it being oppressive, because for them to do so, they need to be in contact with the state and be in contact with their colonial authority. So yeah, if anyone else has anything they want to say, again, feel free to put your hands up. Okay, Asosa? Okay, whilst Asosa speaking, I'm going to try and change the settings so that anyone can just unmute.
Yeah, kind of relating to like the language of migration is like, for example, like in the conflict in the Middle Belt of Nigeria is often framed as like a religious conflict, because the farmers in northern Nigeria are mainly like predominantly Muslim, and then the Middle Belt is predominantly Christian, and so it's framed as like a religious like skirmish or like a religious like conflict or fight. And I feel like doing so, like again, like talking about the power in the way that you frame language, and it's like that the farmers are in the middle belt because northern Nigeria is not tenable for them anymore, because they can't like graze their cows on the land anymore. Like it's not enough to provide for them and their families, and et cetera, et cetera. So like again, the way that we framing it as a religious conflict obscures the very real climate realities of it, and then also like in like trying to like formulate solutions then to the conflicts, you end up doing so inadequately. So yeah, so just like to drive home like the point about language and how it's so important. Like it may seem pedantic, but it's so important that the language that we use is correct. To actually name things by their name is so important.
Yeah, most definitely. We can go on to the next slide. So then talking about wildlife displacement. So again, kind of drawing on like farming and those things. Drawing on like farming and the patterns in farming, when considering like wildlife displacement and how animals migrate and trees also migrate. I didn't know that trees migrate, which is really interesting, but trees migrate if you didn't know. And seeing how they migrate to fit their environment, and if temperatures are rising at exponential rates, and if rain is falling at like never seen before rates, it also means that wildlife goes where it needs to survive. And it may be that like a particular tree that exists in a certain area, and many of like the indigenous communities use that tree for whatever it may be. It may be like for food, for resources, for like guidance or whatever. It then means that they are now uprooted and they leave. And yeah, I think, yeah, like the climate crisis exists beyond like everything that we've spoken about. It also attacks nature, and you don't think that nature can be attacked because like it's rooted in the ground. But we're going to see that, give it, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, there's going to be complete changes in the way that we see nature and like the geology of it all. So Nicole, can you unmute, or do I still need to unmute?
Oh no, I can unmute. But yeah, I feel like completely, and in some part, again, capitalism, like say for example, when like with fishing and stuff, I remember, I think in Canada, they had a breed of salmon that wasn't native to the land. No, was it salmon or catfish? One of them. And they brought in external, I'm going to say catfish, to the waters there. And that essentially wiped out an entire population of like a native species. And so that obviously has like, that affects the terms like trophic cascade or whatever. But that affects like the levels of the ecosystem in general. So like the certain fish that were there, they don't get to eat their prey, and then that affects the wildlife in a sense, and essentially the whole system collapses in on itself. So I feel like in terms of wildlife displacement, like there's also an element of like human involvement in that as well, where like, well, obviously there's human involvement, but like in terms of like physically displacing the animal, taking them out of an area where they're native to and bring them to another area so that they can meet the demand for consumerism. And yeah, that's dangerous.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you. I'm just going to read out what James said. So disclaimer, my internet is rubbish, so sorry if this takes ages to come through. But the Moose Lake case in Alberta about ownership of land and how the energy regulator actually began negotiations to provide formal legal definition of who had rights to the land, only then to pull out and build the tar sands mine anyway. It's just attacking people's rights to live and the environment. Yeah, why does capitalism exist, please? And I also wanted to draw attention to like fish migration as well. Like we spoke about overfishing and like food insecurity, but I think when the climate crisis does exist, and because these continents don't exist in isolation, like West Africa doesn't just exist over there, and Europe doesn't just exist over there. Like there are oceans that, you know, bind all of this together. So when something happens, let's say, for example, in the global north, and it means that fish need to migrate, or if something happens in West Africa and fish need to like emigrate, then it also means that overfishing is made it means that fishing is made harder, because there's scarcer fish, or the fish that are there they're not used to them, they're not in their regular diets, they're just new, and they need to now become acquainted to that, and they need to kind of like account for that as well. And I also think when considering like the climate crisis, but the climate crisis caused by capitalism, so overproduction and the, you know, the CO2 gases and all of these things that are so harmful to our environment, that impacts the quality of water and the quality of air. It also means that fish die because the waters are unclean. And then also thinking about like capitalism causing oil spills, or not causing oil spills, but the need for oil increasing the likelihood, or increasing like the likelihood of oil spills. It means that fish are also at harm. And like water, what's the word for water? You know, like life in water, that all of that is completely catastrophized. So Nicole and then Asosa.
Yeah, like I lost my train of thought. Yeah, like I completely agree. I think that in terms of the importance that wildlife has to general ecosystems and stuff like that, and like how that impacts human life. So say, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, where I can't remember what the exact cause was, but like the removal of a certain fish has essentially led to a lack of oxygen, because the fish that were there ate like the plankton and the algae that were there, and because of that there was an increased growth of algae, and so the oxygen in the water basically depleted, and essentially that water is like toxic now, and that essentially expands outwards. And then also like in terms of like you were saying, like with fish migration and stuff like that, that affects like the currents and the cold and warm water streams and stuff like that. And I feel like not enough attention is put on the effects that will have globally. Do you know what I mean? Like you can focus on overfishing in like the UK, for example, and not see how that has an effect for the fish in Antarctica, when in actuality, because of the way that the water like connects everything, it does have like a significant impact on that.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. So then Annabelle.
Yeah, and I think like Nicole, your point made me think about like the arrogance that capitalism like has, like the arrogance of, oh yeah, like I'll just move one fish from one place and put it in another and everything will be fine. And then just repeatedly doing it, you know, even when it's proven not to be fine, like just a complete disregard and arrogance. I was thinking this also when I was watching the Netflix documentary on like the orcas at SeaWorld, like the lack of knowledge that we have on like the sea, for example, on like fish and like aquatic life, etc., like is so profound. And yet we kind of, capitalism kind of moves as if it knows everything and understands everything and can do whatever. Like a lot of like, for example, Nicole, what you're saying about how like, yeah, so when that fish was there and it wiped out all the other fish and it had this knock-on effect as a result, capitalism didn't know that before it went and did it. Do you know what I mean? Like we don't know everything that is to know about nature and the environment. We don't know everything that is to know about the sea and the world and etc. And so the way that capitalism just so boldly moves to like uproot one species and put it in another as if there's not going to be, it just blows my mind. Like you actually don't have the knowledge to be like moving like this. But yeah, so it just made me think about how bold and how arrogant, like, well, we've been new, but again, how bold and arrogant capitalism is, and the extreme side effects and consequences that then has on sea life and, you know, global life as well.
Like capitalism does not have the range whatsoever. I don't know why it moves like it does, because it doesn't. Anyway, Annabelle.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, like, with the respect to like fishing, obviously another huge issue we see is like European and Asian like fishing fleets, like fishing like with huge fishing vessels all down like the west coast of Africa, and like completely like over exploiting the fish stocks, and like for the local people who in certain areas particularly like will fish in like very, very small boats, like with like only a few people on, and then like how in like no world could they really compete with the huge industrial like fishing vessels, and we're completely like just destroying like those ecosystems. But the fact that the people largely, I think for the most part, who are eating that fish in like Europe and stuff, like are totally disconnected to like to where that fish has even come from, and like the livelihoods that have like been disrupted. Like I guess our system, like global system, just you're so disconnected, like or at least more in the global north, I suppose you're very disconnected from where like our food and our resources come from, and like this like overfishing along like the West African coast, like that's been linked to like, so local people have had to find like alternate sources of food, which has included like bushmeat, which has been connected to that increased like zoonosis spillovers, because people are coming into like closer contact with wild animals, which they would have maybe traditionally ate, but not in the same quantities. So it's like more risky, like with how much is now having to be consumed, as people are just like desperately like trying to find alternatives, because like their ideal resources are just being like consumed by like people in the global north.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think with like that point is so important, because there's such a trade-off, and it's like these people who have been eating tilapia, have been eating sardines, they've been eating the fish, and they're incorporated not only into like their daily life, but it's part of a wider legacy of like the historic, like it's part of their history, it's part of their culture. And because of the climate crisis now, they've now had to completely come and change that and adapt, and maybe not even adapt, like who knows, because we haven't seen the implications of it yet, but we don't know what the effect is, which is I think why it's so scary, because many people could lose their lives because of plant migration, when plant migration and like fish migration are only happening because of the climate crisis. And I also think in terms of the second point, so loss of coastal fish habitat, i.e. mangroves, also what I found out recently, mangroves are often used, or they're often very helpful during like a tornado or like a tsunami, because they restrict the, like, they stop the friction, they stop the force, not friction, they stop the force, so the eventual effect on the land isn't as high as it would have been if the mangroves weren't there. But because these mangroves are now like their season to exist, it means that when natural disasters do happen, the effect is felt ever more, because there wasn't that protection that previously had existed. So yeah, I think this is just opening up to how vulnerable and susceptible to harm many West African countries and communities are being made as a result of the climate crisis. And then James also said, especially on the, this word, thermohaline circulation, the greenhouse gases causing it to shut down. It's the largest Gulf Stream in the Atlantic. It holds loads of blue carbon and keeps the Atlantic ecosystem going. Sad face indeed. Mangroves are great. They absorb wave energy. Thank you, James. Knowledge. Sorry, bit of geography stand. Listen, we love a bit of geography here, because you know when we acknowledge that geography isn't just about, I don't know, because I did geography like GCSE. It's not just about, I don't know, I can't, like the Earth's core and the mantle, you know, it's not about that. It's completely tied to capitalism. It's completely tied to history. We understand geography now because of people who came before us, because of geographers before, farmers even, who gave geographers that knowledge that is like being presented to us as, you know, this is the way, the truth and the life, when it's not. You know? So moving on to the next slide, please. So I think this is one of our last slides. So disease and illness, I'll read out the 2 quotes and then we'll go on to explain. So variation in climatic conditions such as temperature, rainfall patterns and humidity has a large effect on the longevity of the mosquito and on the development of malaria parasites in the mosquito and subsequently on malaria submission. And that's from a weather-driven model of malaria transmission by M.B. Hoshin and A.P. Morse. And also, malaria epidemics often occur after periods of unusually heavy rainfall. In addition, warming in the East African highlands is allowing malaria-carrying mosquitoes to survive at higher altitudes, and that's from climate change is an increasing threat to Africa. And this is all to say that with rising temperatures, animals are not only are they like existing, but they're thriving, they're producing at mass. And because West Africa is like underdeveloped, there's not as much healthcare, like the healthcare isn't as like, it's not the same as it is here, for example. So it means that they're made even more susceptible because they're more likely to be harmed by these mosquitoes because of the high temperatures, but they're also more likely to die at the expense of these mosquitoes because colonialism has meant that colonialism and like continued exploitation, corruption, and all of these like factors that are often regarded, often relegated to colonialism, and people say that they don't exist anymore, or like people diminish how much they exist. Because of those factors, it's meant that disease and illness is made even greater, and we can see the impact of disease and illness as a result of the climate crisis even clearer now. So yeah, if anyone has anything that they want to say about disease, illness, maybe even like COVID as well, and how that all ties into like the climate crisis. So Asosa, then Nicole.
Yeah, I think on the point of like healthcare as well, I'll keep on banging on about it because I wrote an essay on it recently, but like the structural adjustment policies that like neoliberal institutions like the World Bank and the IMF instituted in like the global south have like led to a privatization of like healthcare, specifically like the way that we've seen, like, for example, maternal mortality rates jump in the aftermath of like healthcare being increasingly privatized in the global south is like so alarming. But it made me think, like, as you were talking, it made me think of how like capitalism has created a climate crisis, which has then led to disease being spread more and illness being spread more, which has then meant more people need healthcare, whilst at the same time capitalism has privatized healthcare and made it increasingly difficult for people to access healthcare. So it's like you've set someone up for a fall, and then you've hamstringed the way that they're able to react to and deal with. And I know we talked about this in the last event that we did, talking about Haiti and like the historic legacies of like the debts that was levied against them, and how that then like ties their hands to a certain extent into how they're able to react to climate crises. But I think that point is also relevant here as well. Like capitalism not only delivers the climate crisis, but then also capitalism decides who is able to react to the climate crisis and how are they able to react to the climate crisis and how are they able to protect themselves from the climate crisis. So yeah, I think it's also important to note that like not only does the capitalism create the climate crisis, but it also then dictates how the global south is able to respond to the climate crisis as well, or the repercussions of the climate crisis. I think Nicole was next with
Oh yeah, like yeah, I completely agree. I was literally about to say the same thing about like in terms of access and how climate change affects that, but also like I feel like not enough necessarily is being done to research the things that we don't know about. And I know that sounds like it doesn't make sense, but like in terms of like climate change, and so for example melting ice caps, there's like theories and stuff like that there are like they're disease, like the way that the layers of the ice work and stuff like that, like there could be a case where like there are diseases that are trapped within the ice, and then it only needs them to be like it only needs for the ice to be melted for that whatever the disease is in those like layers of air bubbles and stuff like that to come out and then affect. Like yes, we have like COVID and stuff like that, but there could be potentially like super viruses that we as humans are not equipped to deal with, because obviously this was thousands and thousands of years ago. And I also feel like, in terms of like linking like deforestation to diseases and stuff like that, say for example, like indigenous communities which live essentially in areas that are like, there isn't cities and stuff like that. So say for example, the indigenous community in the Amazon rainforest, making them more susceptible to diseases that they can't fight. Like say for like, I don't know what tribe it is, but there's a tribe in the Amazon rainforest where it's like, they like, as like people outside of that tribe cannot even go in and like understand or educate. Like we literally have to stay so far, like we have to stay away from them because they are not, their bodies haven't become used to or haven't adapted to things like the common cold and stuff like that. So as deforestation makes things like the Amazon rainforest smaller, or as temperatures increase and more diseases become prominent, we put people at risk that don't even know how to like deal with it, or don't have access to understanding how to deal with it, and then you could potentially wipe out entire communities with that.
Yeah, I was just going to say on the first point that you made about like diseases like trapped in the ice and as it's melting. Like I read an article at the beginning of the year, and it was talking about like there had been an outbreak of, I think, anthrax in like this community, like in like northern Russia or somewhere in Russia, and they were saying like that strain of anthrax that you hadn't been seen in like hundreds, if not thousands of years. Like it's so old, and it like basically almost completely wiped out their cattle, and then was also affecting the people in that community as well. And again, I think it relates back to like we just don't know. Like we can predict many of the consequences of the climate crisis based on the knowledge that we have, but there's a lot of consequences that we just don't know until it arrives. Like they didn't know that there was anthrax thousands of years old in the ice until it melted, and everyone got infected by the anthrax. Yeah, so it's like that again, like that arrogance that capitalism has. Like we actually just don't know. And then the other point that you were making about the those indigenous communities in the Amazonian rainforest as well, like yeah, like the point that you were making about how like you're exposing them to so much, potentially exposing them to like genocide, essentially like biological genocide, because they don't have the immunoprotection. But then also in doing so, like in accidentally wiping out entire communities of people, you've also erased all of their knowledge of the land and of the rainforest that you need in order to continue protecting the rainforest as well, and the vital role that those communities play in tending to the rainforest, like the stuff that they do that we don't know how to do, or we don't even know that they're doing, that keeps the rainforest, like the Amazonian rainforest, like kind of ticking along. So yeah, just like all of the unforeseen or unpredictable consequences of climate change or the climate crisis that we're yet to see. Just kind of, it's a bit scary to think on, but like it's just, we just have to be so careful and always like almost ground capitalism, be like, you actually don't know, like you don't, like Rachel said, you don't have the range to be acting like this.
Yeah, 100%. And I think I completely agree. Both of you were just, spitting off each other. And I think just to say like what you were saying, it's really contextualized like how much of a trap this is. Like we're told, Africa and like a lot of countries like victim to colonialism or affected by colonialism are told, actually all you need to do is get renewable energy and do all of these things and you'll be fine. Whereas really we know that's not the case. No matter how many solar panels are put up in Africa, or no matter how many like wind turbines are put anywhere in the world in like underdeveloped countries, it's not going to compensate for the violence and the harm that the climate crisis is like perpetuating today. And yeah, I guess it's kind of like moves us on to the next slide, which should be, what can we do? What are the solutions? Because even just seeing, or just like as I was researching a lot of the resources and a lot of the information that I did get were from like NGOs, such as like the UN and like other smaller like NGOs. But then at the same time, we know that the UN just doesn't exist to help racialized communities. Like we know in its legacy that it doesn't exist to do so. So how much can we trust them? What alternatives do we have? What responsibilities do we have? How can we attack the climate crisis, or can we? So go on.
Yeah, I think like on NGOs, not to keep on bashing, no, in fact, to keep on bashing like the IMF and the World Bank and the UN, etc. Like it's not like that they're neutral actors in like the global scene. Like they exist for a reason. Like they are a tool of like Western imperialism. They are a tool of like capitalism, etc. So it's like, yeah, okay, fine, you're documenting like the climate catastrophe, but you're also not even low-key, like high-key perpetuating it. Like the master that you serve relies on this to continue happening. So you can document it for like morality's sake, or just for the sake of documenting it and feeling like you've actually done something. But not only are you not really doing anything to help or doing much to help, you're kind of like, you're the one that's adding the fuel to the fire and then sprinkling like raindrops on the fire and being like, oh yeah, we're helping, but like you've not stopped dousing the fire with fuel at the same time. So yeah, I feel like I don't really like NGOs at all, like not to like be so like pessimistic about them, but I just like they exist, they're not neutral actors, like they exist for the betterment. Like they were set up by the West and they exist to protect the supremacy and the and Western like capitalism, etc. So yeah.
James, I'm going to read out what you said. And usually the hydroelectric dam infrastructure projects are tied to OPEC conditions from the north about Belt and Road, healthcare, limits on sustainable environmental development, linked to further control. OPEC is the worst of the IMF spin-offs. OPEC is terrible. I just feel like, especially, I mean, I know of OPEC through like the OPEC crisis, and even through that, it's like they say that they like approach these countries in hope of like recovering them and in hope of like helping them recover from such a crisis. But then we know even the way that they do so is so colonial. Like it just reeks of colonialism. It reeks of capitalism. It's like, if you're going to help someone, help them. Like, don't have ulterior motives. But capitalism always has ulterior motives. So, you know, there's that. And I also wanted to speak about how unfair the solutions to the climate crisis, how unfair the way the West presents the solutions to the climate crisis, because like Britain and a lot of like Western countries in the, I should know this, but in like the 1600s, 1500s, 1800s, how they could have their industrial revolution. And not only could they have their industrial revolution, but they had their industrial revolution based on the like exploitation and abuse of so many Black communities, Black and brown communities, as a result of colonialism, imperialism. Whereas now when it comes to African countries like hoping to develop themselves, not even economically, but just in terms of like their infrastructure and allowing themselves to navigate and operate in the world as it exists today, we know that like a lot of Western countries are saying, no, actually, you're not entitled to your own growth, your own industrial revolution, because it damages the environment, it damages the climate. Whereas they had the liberty to thousands of years ago, even though not only did it damage the environment, but it was also, yeah, true, you can say something, but it was also founded off exploitation. And I think that relationship is just so sinister, because they're hoping, African countries are hoping to get to a point where they can navigate, and the West are saying no, because of the climate crisis, that these West African countries aren't even, they don't even contribute to. So yeah, Trin, you can put your hand up and then, or you can just unmute.
Thank you. I don't think I have the hand button, but Hi everyone. I just wanted to really agree with Rachel, your last point about how many I don't know, like undeveloped countries aren't given the same, like they're not allowed to use the same measures as like developed countries, because a lot of developed countries all developed countries really depended on exploiting the environment and degrading the environment, which is really interesting. But it's like now they're developed and they have the privilege to I don't know, focus on like, okay, let's be green after they've exploited the environment. It's very interesting in the way in which they treat African countries, Asian countries who are really affected by this. I think a really good example was like the Kyoto Protocol, where Bush like refused to, he non-ratified the USA from it because developing countries were exempt, in that they didn't have to commit to like, I think like reducing their carbon and all of that. But I just think that's really interesting, and also in like climate adaptation as well. So not only in like mitigation, in terms of like increasingly like undeveloped countries are expected to commit to the same that like developed countries are now committing to, again after they've exploited the environment to develop. But even in climate change adaptation, a lot of countries are treated as though like, okay, we're doing you a favor by like giving you a bit of money, or like it's kind of like everyone's like side-eyeing like, oh yeah, good luck guys. But a lot of the things that our countries have to adapt to is from like the exploitation of developed countries to develop, which I just think is crazy. Sorry, I'm not really good at articulating myself, so I hope I made sense, but yeah.
You did amazing, sweetie. Nicole? Okay. Wait, Nicole, can you unmute?
Oh yeah, I can. Sorry, I was just waiting for permission. Yeah, I agree with Trinity. I feel like when it comes to adaptation and mitigation and stuff like that, I feel like there's an expectancy for developing countries to, you know, invest in new technologies and new resources and stuff like that, when the fact is they don't necessarily have the resources or the finance to deal with the like the long-term issues when they are faced with the short-term consequences of climate change. Like you can say, yeah, build defenses for tsunamis and invest in things like irrigation and all of the things that you can use to mitigate and like adapt to the impacts of climate change and mitigate against it. But at the same time, it's like we can't do that if we have drought. We can't do that if we're currently recovering from the last tsunami that just hit and there's no resources and stuff like that. And I feel like a lot of the stuff is like colonial ties as well, if you think about the way that countries respond to other countries. So for example, after Hurricane Maria, countries like Dominica, Haiti, stuff like that, they didn't get the resources because they weren't affiliated. Like I think France was helping the countries that they had colonial ties to, but like countries which had like ties to the UK or stuff like that, the UK wasn't given as much, or France wasn't given as much, or I can't remember which countries it was, but the ties that they had because of colonialism meant that they were able to get help where others weren't. And I feel like it just all kind of like links in and stuff like that. And in terms of having the expectation to change and to do stuff when they haven't been given the resources to do that is what's the word? I want to say contradicting, but it's not contradicting I'm looking for. But yeah.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, I really like that point. Association there.
Yeah, I think it relates to like the point that you've written on corporations versus individuals and like responsibility. Like the global north have created this climate crisis, and then they're laying the blame and the responsibility on the global south to like fix it, or to like, you know, suddenly be sustainable, etc. And not to like move the discussion, but then to like talk about the corporations versus individuals point. Like for example, I'm not sure if people saw the Seaspiracy documentary on Netflix. I personally didn't watch it, but my sister did, and was telling me about it, and I felt like the response to that documentary was like, this is why everyone should be vegan, this is why people should stop eating fish. And I remember having a conversation with my sister about it. And my sister was like, yeah, like telling me all the stuff that the documentary said. And then she was like, this is why everyone should be vegan and vegetarian. And I was like, I don't hear that and think this is why individuals should be vegan and vegetarian. I hear that and think, let's abolish capitalism. You know what I mean? Like, I saw so many people on like Instagram, like when it first came out, like reposting it and, you know, talking about people that were silent during Black Lives Matter were like reposting it and talking about why people should be vegan and vegetarian. And I'm like, this is not like this shouldn't be the response. Like, why are we putting it on like individuals? Like, why are we placing the blame on this onto individuals when it's corporations, when it's capitalism that has created this? Like, why is your response not let's abolish the systems that have created this? Like, let's just abolish capitalism? But yeah.
Yeah, and even on that, I think like I know we haven't really spoken about it and we have 2 minutes left, oopsie, but in terms of like people saying, okay, because of the climate crisis, you should be vegan, to many indigenous like African communities, I just feel like that comes with a sense of superiority, yes, but it is a factor, it is a form of like neo-colonialism, saying that actually no, because of the damage that I have done, you should now completely disengage with your culture that engages with, that eats fish, that eats meat, because the West wanted to come and overexploit and just, you know, completely like tarnish and just mess up the way these indigenous communities have been like existing. So that's point one. Like, I just think there's a real cheek, like there's a cheek, like the audacity, you know, like how audacious. And then what Nicole was saying about like countries helping, like the colonial countries, the colonial empires helping its like ex-colonies, but then at the same time there's also important, like it's also important to realize that you're not like, it shouldn't be a matter of helping, it's like you, not only were you an active contributor, because of the harm and because of the violence inflicted throughout colonialism, France and Britain and Spain and all these colonial powers, they have a duty to not only care, but also ensure that these countries, do they have a duty though? I don't know. But I don't know, I just feel like they should make sure that these countries that they're completely underdeveloped are somewhere where are in a position where they can completely like detach themselves from them. But because of underdevelopment, because for example, using the example of like Haiti, because they made Haiti, like Haiti was in debt to them, they were now in a position where they needed help when that shouldn't have been the case. I'm not sure if I'm getting that across properly, but Nicole, you can go and then I'll read out the comments and then we'll conclude.
Oh, sorry, I didn't put my hand down.
Okay, so from the chat, it says, literally, like the multi-millionaire celebs who were telling us to go vegan after they watched Seaspiracy. Like the cheek, like you are eating caviar. Do you even know where caviar comes from? Like, anyway, they're so annoying. Reparations now. Yes, completely, reparations now. So I think that's everything. If anyone has anything that they want to say, feel free to put your hand up. If not, yeah, time to conclude. Thank you everyone so much for coming, engaging in this conversation. I really enjoyed this. I feel like I really always like enjoyed the climate change events. Like maybe it's the geographer in me. I should look into that more. But thank you all so much for contributing, for listening. I hope you learned something. I hope you take something away from this. Again, you can find us like at our socials, and you can like talk to us, DM us, you know, we can keep it rolling. So yeah, thank you everyone. And the next event is at 2:30. Yeah, 2:30. And that is decolonizing queerness, and we have a panel for that discussion. So we will see you then. Again, feel free to leave, or you can just like meet yourself and come back whenever you want. So thank you everyone.
Thank you guys, thank you so much. And thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much.